Okay. We're here to talk about the issue of gun safety, which is an issue that has been developed for many, many, many years. And the people who are joining us this morning are at the vanguard of pushing for gun safety and have done tremendous work. I've worked with them for many years in various capacities, and I think the bills that we expect today will pass in large part because of their advocacy and their ongoing efforts. It's been an uphill battle, and for many of them it's been a personal battle, and I personally applaud them for their personal strength. Linda Beagle-Schulman is with us. Michael Schulman is with us. They had a recent tragedy when they lost their son Scott at Parkland. And to take that pain and to turn it into a positive is really one of the greatest tests of character, I think. And what the Schulmans have done has been amazing. The moms who demand action have been so effective. I have seen them everywhere across the state. They've organized all across the state. And they've just communicated the facts to people. And that has worked extraordinarily well. We'll also hear from Rebecca Fisher for New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, that has been working on this issue for many, many years through the various stages. And the basic effort has always been to try to separate the politics from the common sense solution for this issue. Because the common sense solution was always obvious, and the common sense solution was always accepted by the majority of Americans, whether they were gun owners or non-gun owners. You know, the modern debate on gun safety really started about 1994. We had gone through gun safety debates in the past. Machine guns were at one time legal in the early 1900s, and we decided common sense that machine guns were too dangerous. 1994, the debate is federal, and they passed the Brady Law banning assault weapons. And that really politicizes the issue into what we see in modern day discourse, I believe. 2000, we were chatting inside. I have a memento on my desk from Smith & Wesson that I keep on my desk since the year 2000, almost 20 years. In 2000, I'm in the Clinton administration, and we sign what's called the Safe Gun Agreement with Smith & Wesson. Smith & Wesson was the largest handgun manufacturer in the United States of America. And the Clinton administration had gotten involved in numerous lawsuits that were brought against gun manufacturers by states, by attorneys general, et cetera, where for negligence, basic negligence in the distribution of their product. The gun manufacturers were very nervous that one of these lawsuits could actually connect. We put together a safe code of conduct that would settle all the lawsuits. That was dramatically and revolutionary. No more than 10 bullets in a gun. Developing fingerprint ID technology, where the trigger would only work for the authorized user, where the manufacturers agreed to close the gun show loopholes and do background checks at all gun shows. This was signed by Smith & Wesson at a Rose Garden ceremony with President Clinton. And it was the largest handgun manufacturer saying, we can do this. We signed the agreement. This was the memento of the day. I had worked to spearhead it for the Clinton administration. Smith & Wesson signs. I believe we're poised for the other manufacturers to now follow, because Smith & Wesson was the largest manufacturer, and we started with the largest, because if you can get Smith & Wesson, well, then the other ones will come along, was the thinking. What happens is the exact opposite. It was just about the time of the Al Gore-Bush election. It became highly politicized. The NRA attacked the Smith & Wesson president for cooperating with the Clinton administration. The Smith & Wesson president said, I was doing it in my own best interest. I was settling the lawsuits, and I was afraid of the lawsuits. The political environment gets so hot, they fire the president of Smith & Wesson. And they boycott Smith & Wesson. And then Bush says in the campaign, if I become president, I will immunize gun manufacturers from liability. The only industry in the United States of America that is immunized from a civil lawsuit are the gun manufacturers. And that polarized the issue in that campaign. The other manufacturers who we had been talking to about signing the agreement all back up and said, well, let's wait and see what happens in the election. Bush wins the election. He passes the immunity for gun manufacturers. The Smith & Wesson president is fired, and we're right back to where we started. And I've kept this on my desk ever since. We passed the SAFE Act right after the Sandy Hook massacre in Connecticut. It was the most comprehensive, most aggressive, safe gun agreement in the United States of America. We took tremendous political heat. And people argued, well, Sandy Hook is a once in a lifetime. That will never happen again. There'll never be another school shooting. Governor Cuomo overreacted, and this was just a one-time situation. He should have never done this. And it was all political. Obviously, we were right. Sometimes history irrefutably bears out your actions. Sandy Hook, Connecticut was not the last. In many ways, it was the first. It was the first of this scourge of violence and depravity and mass shootings and school shootings, which was a phenomenon we had never seen. You look at Parkland, I'm sorry to mention it, but Sandy Hook, Connecticut, 6 years ago, Parkland today, it was a precursor. It wasn't the extraordinary exception. And as you know better than I, the numbers have gotten only worse. The nation is still unable to deal with this issue. And politicians are still afraid of this issue. They are afraid of this issue. Not because their fear is not based in reality. I passed the SAFE Act. It cost me tremendously in terms of political popularity, et cetera. I alienated people in this state who I never got back. Why? Because it's such a threshold litmus test issue. It's almost a cultural issue for people. And there's a deep-seated fear that once government starts to act on guns, well, now the slippery slope, and they're going to outlaw guns, and that's what this is really about. They want to outlaw guns, and once you give them a little piece, then it's going to take off from there. All garbage, all sensationalism, all meant to frighten people. I now talk about the SAFE Act to prove the exact opposite. We did it 6 years ago. Hunters, sports people still have their guns. Nobody's gun was taken away. It's done nothing but good. Over 100,000 people in this state are now on a mental health database which did not exist before the SAFE Act. 100,000 people who could have walked in and bought a gun, who now can't buy a gun because they're on a mental health database. 43,000 registered assault weapon owners. so you know who owns them and where they are, and they've passed the background check. So it's done nothing but good. Anecdotally, the number of incidents in this state, comparable to what's going on nationwide. We haven't been free from violence, but we have been spared from truly mass violence incidents. Thank God. There's no causal relationship necessarily, but I think we sent the right signal, and I hope that helped. And today is the next evolution in this ongoing crusade, and it will be ongoing. I raised the point about Smith & Wesson. That's 20 years just for me. And I don't want you to think that the job is over today, because it is unfolding. But it is going in the right direction. I think more and more Americans are seeing the problem and understanding that this has to be depoliticized to come up with a common sense reform. And there has to be a way to allow people who can have guns and should have guns to enjoy their gun, but not have this senseless violence where people who are mentally ill, people who are past felons have guns, or you can literally transfer a gun one from the other without any background check, et cetera. And that's the fight that you wage. And we take a big step forward today. Ban bump stocks because they make no sense. There is no legitimate sports person who will say, oh yes, I use a bump stock. Bump stocks, you can't even aim the gun with a bump stock. The only purpose is rapid fire without any specific aiming. It makes no sense. So banning bump stocks, increasing the waiting period for people who did not pass the background check. The way we do the background check in this nation is almost in reverse. You can have a right to buy a gun unless the background check says you don't. And right now, if you're not cleared within 3 days, you have a right to buy the gun. But you're not cleared. Yes, but the system didn't clear me in 3 days, and if you can't reject me in 3 days, then I'm deemed approved. Why? Some states, by the way, say you can't buy a gun unless you are affirmatively approved. Right now, it's if you're not rejected in 3 days, you can buy a gun. We want to extend that. Many states have 30 days to reject, and that makes sense to us. And the third is what we call the red flag law, which is just common sense again. You see so many of these teachers who are interviewed after tragic incidents say, we knew there was a problem, we knew something was wrong, but what could we do? Family members who say, I knew there was something wrong, but what could we do? Well, there should be something to do. If you believe a person is mentally ill and needs help and has access to guns and could be violent to himself, herself, or to others, do something. Do something. Don't wait for the inevitable tragedy. You see a car going off a cliff. Don't stand there and watch. So, red flag law, extreme protection, give a teacher, give a family member a right to go to a judge, give the person due process, but if they are in a position where they could hurt themselves or others, remove them from guns in the meantime. It is common sense. Now, you'll see the political extremes rise up, same argument for the past 25 years. Oh, it's another restriction, it's another slippery slope, they won't be happy until they take my gun. No one wants to take guns from legal owners who are mentally healthy. We don't want people who are mentally ill or past felons to have guns. That's all this is. And any reasonable American who looks at what's going on in this country, I believe, agrees with that, if we can just depoliticize it. And that's what the people in this room have done so well. With that, let me turn it over to Rebecca Fisher. It's my pleasure to be with her again. I've worked with New Yorkers Against Gun Violence for a long, long time, 20 years since you started.
25.
25.
That's right.
Oh, am I old? Rebecca Fisher, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Governor Cuomo. Hi, my name is Rebecca Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. And as the governor said, we've been around for 25 years fighting for sensible gun laws at the local, state, and federal levels. This is such an important day for New York and really for the entire nation, because today New York is once again setting an example for the rest of the country to follow. Thanks to the leadership of Governor Cuomo and our legislature, we are making New York's gun laws even stronger and even safer. These common sense measures will prevent more senseless tragedies and keep our children and our communities safe. At a time when people across the country are demanding change, Governor Cuomo is listening and he is taking action. He doesn't just talk about it, he's getting it done, and he's getting it done early. So on behalf of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, I want to thank the governor and the legislature for spearheading this life-saving legislation. Under their leadership, New York has led the way with the strongest gun safety legislation in the country, and today we will all make our laws even stronger. Thank you all to the advocates that have worked together, to the survivors that have fought hard, for all of the lawmakers. And today, I am prouder than ever to live in a state that is at the forefront of the fight to end gun violence. Thank you.
Well said, as usual, Rebecca. As I mentioned earlier, we have the Schulmans with us, Linda and Michael, who lost their son, Scott, who grew up in Long Island and went to Florida and was teaching in the Parkland School and was heroic in his efforts to help his students and paid the greatest price. And I hope Linda and Michael can find some peace today in knowing that in many ways what happened in Parkland really did accelerate public awareness and with their advocacy brought us to today. So congratulations.
My husband, Michael, my son, Scott, and I are honored and excited to be here today. I have been working towards passing this, having the red flag law passed since February 15th. It has become my mission. Governor Cuomo told me the very first time that I met him, he said, "We will get this done." And here we are today, just a few steps away from having the red flag law passed. And I thank Governor Cuomo and the legislature for putting gun safety on the top of their agenda to get it done. Governor Cuomo, your support and your humanity, which is beyond compare, believing what's right and getting it done and not letting anyone stand in your way, you have my thanks, you have my heart. I know that no matter how senseless and no matter how incomprehensible the Parkland massacre was, Scott's murder was, when we passed the red flag law, thanks to you and the legislature, but so thanks to you, Scott's murder will now save lives. I cannot thank you enough.
Again, what the Schulmans have done, Linda and Michael, I have such extraordinary respect for. Every time I've seen them in an event, and let's put it the other way, I haven't been at an event where I haven't seen Linda and Michael. Their strength and their power and the intelligence of their story and their message is so powerful. I think it's made a fantastic difference in this discussion. And again, God bless you. Handling the death of a child is probably one of the most difficult things anyone can be asked to do, because it is unnatural. It's not the natural order of life. So God bless you for having the strength to rise above. I hope I would have half that strength in this situation. But today is another step forward. It's not going to be everything, but it's another step forward. And when you've been at this crusade as long as I have, you realize sometimes it's stone to stone across the morass, one step at a time. And this is a big positive step. But I will tell you this, New York leads the nation. You put the SAFE Act together with this red flag bill. What New York says is you can do this. You can do this. There is a path forward. There is a solution. And we have 6 years of history to show that the planet does not stop spinning. People don't lose guns. It doesn't bankrupt an industry. None of those myths that they scare you with come true. They're just common sense reforms. And New York, to the extent New York can make that case to the country, that gives me satisfaction, because we have to get the politics out of the conversation and talk to Americans about basic facts. And that's what we're doing here in New York, with your help. So thank you. With that, any questions to the press?
The Supreme Court is taking up the New York City law. They're going to review that, the gun control law. Are you concerned, especially depending on how they rule there, that there will be challenges to this law that could be that put it in jeopardy?
Yes.
Do you think it will be in jeopardy?
See, I try to trap them by just answering the question yes or no.
Almost worked.
It almost worked. Well, Ken Lovett has been around too long. That's why he's moving on to greener pastures. Look, on all of these issues, Ken, what you see in these past few weeks of legislative actions, these are all social issues where New York has long felt this position, but we were stymied from taking these actions because of the conservative wing in the state Senate. They are also in direct juxtaposition to the position of the federal government, which is being governed by the conservative wing. So whether it's we pass Reproductive Health Act and they want to overturn Roe v. Wade federally, we pass a DREAM Act to educate new immigrants. They want to build a border wall. We're passing the red flag bill. They want a strict construction of the Second Amendment. I have no doubt that this Supreme Court, which was packed by this president and was passed by his political litmus test, will do everything they can to strike down gun laws. Now, they're going to have to trample state rights to do that, which is going to put them in a philosophical, hypocritical position, right? Because one of the basic planks of the conservative federal doctrine was defer to states' rights, defer to state and local. Government closest to the people knows best. That's what they argued for all those years. So to now do 180 degree and this philosophical somersault where they want to dictate from the bureaucrats in Washington what local government should do, that's going to take a philosophical flexibility that Gumby couldn't accomplish. But I think that's what they will attempt to do, yes. And that's why it's more important that we are aggressive and go forward.
I do recall back in 2013, there was kind of this hysteria that people were coming for their guns, so to speak. But with the red flag law, doesn't that take that sort of an incremental step in their worst nightmares direction, where guns will be taken away? And forgive me for getting too into the minds of rural gun owners, but aren't they skeptical that the government can make the best determination as to who's eligible for that kind of action?
What the government does, the basic rule, Zach, is Second Amendment, yes, not if you're mentally ill, okay? That's the basic point. So we have a background check system, which will look at past offenses, and in New York, after the SAFE Act, a mental health check, not if you're mentally ill. So there can be a situation where you purchase a gun or you acquire a gun and now develop mental illness after having been in possession of the gun, or demonstrating behavior that would suggest to family members or a teacher that you are mentally ill, and you have a gun. For your own protection, as well as for the protection of people around you, they should have a right to go to a judge and say, will you please look at the situation involving Zach? Judges make determinations all the time as to whether or not you are mentally fit to protect yourself or others, right? Extreme danger to yourself or to others. You can be, by government, involuntarily committed at one point. So government does make those decisions. This is a much lower threshold. Are you exhibiting behavior that would lead reasonable people to think you have mental health issues and you could hurt yourself as well as others? And then you have a full due process right to have your doctors say, that's just the way Zach is. I know it seems bizarre to people, and I know his actions are different than most normal human beings, but that's Zach Fink, and that's the normal Zach Fink, and he's not a danger to others. But government does make those decisions. And again, it's for the protection of the individual as well as others.
Governor, sorry, just follow up, if there was an appeal of that, that would go up to what, to some appellate panel, right?
The appeal of, Mr. Goma, the individual decision,
Right. It would be subject to that anyway.
it would be subject to an appeal process, right?
So once you start to get to the appellate panel, where you've got you've got judges that are more of a statewide look, is there a concern, or did you have any concern doing this, that you actually were taking that step where the opponents could accurately say, this is a law where government will take away guns? I understand what you're saying about due process, but did you hesitate at all on that?
Well, you're there already, because if you don't pass a mental health background check, you can't buy the gun. So we have passed the point of saying, if you are mentally ill, you are not qualified to buy a gun in the state of New York. This, in essence, says buy or own a gun. But we have made that determination. Who determines that you are mentally ill? Doctors determine it, and the judge, the judicial system, is the arbiter. Please, would you like to make a comment?
Yes.
Please.
Parkland would have never happened if they had a red flag law. Not ever. Because the active shooter in Parkland, okay, the active shooter in Parkland was in school before he was actually taken out of school and not allowed to return. He had a teacher who we met at a run, and the teacher came up to my husband and myself and said, I had that person as a student in my class for 2 years, and they wanted to give him to me a third year, and I told them that I would resign my position. My husband had spoken to students who had told us that he had threatened and what he wanted to do. And they knew all about it. And our question to them was, well, why didn't you say anything? And they said, because we couldn't, there was no law. There was nothing that was against the law at the time. In March, they did put an extreme risk protection bill in. They enacted one. And in fact, it's been used over 109 times in Florida. That's 109 times that they could have prevented a mass shooting. So if that bill was in place, Parkland wouldn't have happened, and my son would still be here. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
Exactly
I
right.
can also expand on.
Please.
I think it's really important to emphasize the due process protections that are part of this legislation. As the governor said, there's a notice and hearing period. The standard of evidence to actually obtain the order is extremely high, and it's temporary. So even after the initial ex parte order is issued, that is when the hearing takes place, and then it can only be extended for 1 year. So I think that, as you get questions about the due process concerns, those built-in protections are very necessary to emphasize.
Governor, what's the status of the ammunition database at this point?
I don't know. I'll have to check with the state police here.
The state police is working with ITS and have been working with ITS for a while on that issue and trying to come up with a construct that works. As you may know, no state in the country currently has this database in effect, and so they're working on a solution.
You have Democrats in charge of the Senate now, because you had an agreement with the Republicans that you would kind of halt that. Do you think now it'll move forward?
Well, the agreement was always that it has to be right. The database that we now use is a federal database, and no state has set up its own database that then incorporates all the federal information and other state information. Right, one of the challenges you want to set up a state database, but if you just moved into the state, you want data from the other states also, right? You move in from North Carolina, Florida, you've been here for 1 year. It's nice what we know about you, but we want an ability to have our database incorporate national information. So that has been the challenge. I don't think I think it's more a technological challenge, information challenge than a political challenge.
Governor, MGM is closing on the sale of on its purchase of Yonkers Raceway today. They've made no secret that they're going to seek a casino license from the state, but the state law, as it stands now, says you can't do that until 2023. Do you have any intention of moving that date up?
I know it's a topic of conversation, but I have no opinion or intention of making any changes at this time. But it's an evolving field, there's no doubt about that.
Governor, the job isn't done today. What would you like to see moving forward in terms of additional reform?
Well, I think this is going to be a continuing, evolving situation. And I think it's a question of educating the American public and quelling the fears and quelling the myths and the misinformation. I think the NRA is an organization that fundamentally protects gun manufacturers and has spread disinformation to frighten Americans about possibilities which were never the intention and were wholly improbable in the first place. And I don't think you make dramatic change in this country until you really get the public with you. I think we are more evolved in this state. I think the SAFE Act, frankly, helped us tremendously because we're a test case, right? Let's pass the SAFE Act, and I am telling you as governor of New York, none of these horribles are going to happen. But there was a lot of skepticism. It's now been 6 years. The horribles didn't happen. Hunters are still hunting. Sportsmen and women are still sportsmen and women. None of the horribles happened. But I think that you have to build that confidence in people. That's why I'm very proud of that New Yorker's on the lead.
Governor, to kind of bounce off what Zach asked earlier, very broadly, what do you say to people who feel like this is kind of an attack on their culture, their way of life, or just their attitude towards firearms?
Ask them, do you think a mentally ill person should have a gun? 99.9 will say no. And that's what this bill does. And that's why it's really an extension from the SAFE Act that said we should add mental health to the background check. That's what the SAFE Act said. I get past felons, great. How about mentally ill people? Shouldn't we make sure mentally ill people don't buy a gun for their own protection and others? That was the SAFE Act. This says the same thing. On Mr. Gomez's question, SAFE Act says on the day of purchase, you do not have a record of being mentally ill. Okay, now you have the gun, or you acquire a gun subsequently, and you're evidencing mental health issues. What do we do? And this is Linda's point. Teachers say, I had nothing to do. Family members said there was nothing I could do, no one I could go to. Well, that's nonsensical. You're not helping anyone. So this bill says, yes, we believe people who are mentally ill should not have guns for their protection and others. 99% of the people agree with that. There is no culture that says we think everybody should have a gun if you're mentally ill, if you're a felon. Nobody says that.
Governor, you did not include the red flag bill nor the bump stock ban in last year's State of the State. What prompted the change of heart this year?
There was no change of heart. I've supported this every year. What goes in the State of the State is more an editing issue.
So it isn't a list of your priorities?
Yes, it is, but you can't list every priority. I've been working on this issue. You missed the first part of the press conference. I'll call you earlier next time. I've been working on this issue for 20 years, and the SAFE Act, I started in the federal government. The SAFE Act was a first, and then I've been working on this, in many ways, I believe, builds on the SAFE Act every year since. But we'll get you the tape so you can hear the beginning of the press conference.
Senator Parker has a bill that would require a social media check for people who are seeking a pistol permit, and could require the pistol seekers to give up their passwords to their social media accounts. Do you support that bill?
I haven't read the bill, but if you read the comments on me on social media, I wouldn't pass a background check.
Governor, you proposed a lot of measures to restrict campaign finance and to restrict money in politics. Yesterday we heard Corey Johnson, the Speaker of the City Council, say that as he thinks about a mayoral run, he's going to self-impose a lot of restrictions on himself. I'm wondering, are you imposing any self-restrictions on your campaign fundraising? And if not, why not?
Well, it's called the law. I'm proposing changes to the law. I don't think we should run a system where everybody decides what their individual limits should be and who they should receive funding from. Pass the law. I would also say to a speaker, if that's what your belief, that's your belief on what the law should be, propose it as a law for the council to pass. There shouldn't be an individualized system. Jimmy's running, he says he should take 250. Nick is running, he wants to take 1,000. Pass the law.
Governor, the Child Victims Act passed 63-0 yesterday. For 12 years before, it couldn't make it to the floor. What's your reaction?
What do you make of that? The Child Victims Act is another issue that was long overdue. The fact that many of the people who opposed it for so many years changed their opinion on the floor, which is what you're pointing to with the 63-0 vote, is in many ways shocking, but I think it's also a recognition of reality. I know the Catholic Church has made an issue of the Child Victims Act. Just to be clear, the Child Victims Act is not only about the Catholic Church. It covers the Catholic Church, but it covers all public and private institutions. That is not to say that the Catholic Church has not experienced demonstrated situations where this law will be applicable to the Catholic Church. They have done movies spotlight. We've had incidents in Buffalo and in Rochester and in Syracuse where it has been documented that priests have been involved in child abuse for a very long period of time. It has been documented that the Catholic Church was, in my opinion, not aggressive in stopping it when they knew about it. And it has been documented that this has gone on for a very long period of time. And I think Pope Francis has been very clear and very outspoken on his position. It's also been documented that the leadership of our church in this state has opposed the Child Victims Act. I mean, I went through the quotes this morning just to make sure I wasn't missing something. But if you pull their quotes, it's very clear they're against the Child Victims Act, and they have been against the Child Victims Act up until this year. But it's the opinion of the Catholic Church that changed. It's not my opinion that changed. We have the spokesperson for the Catholic Church saying last year, we respectfully differ with the governor regarding an unlimited retroactive window to bring up claims from decades ago against institutions of all kinds. We have His Eminence Dolan saying, the look back we find to be very strangling. When that happens, the only organization targeted is the Catholic Church. I didn't say that. His Eminence said that. He said it targets the Catholic Church. This has occurred in other religious organizations also. It's happened in public institutions also. But the Catholic Church was very out front on their opposition to this issue, as anyone who was in this building, I think, would attest. So they have shifted their position, and that's fine. But I never shifted mine.
Four members of the legislature last night during the vote shared their personal stories of abuse. I'm curious if you watched that vote and how you reacted when you heard these personal stories.
I didn't watch the vote. But look, there was never a question. There was never a question but that this is a real problem in society. I mean, how many news stories did you have to read? How many movies did you have to see? It was never a question of the reality. We have a social, widespread problem of child abuse. We do. That is the fact. And as you've heard me say too many times in this room, you never solve a problem you're unwilling to admit. Admit the problem. We have a gun safety, gun violence issue, mass shooting issue. Admit it. Well, it was only Sandy Hook. Well, it was only one time. No, it's a widespread epidemic. We have a child abuse epidemic. That is the truth. Don't deny it. Don't excuse it. Don't minimize it. It shows a disrespect for the victims. Once you admit it, now let's talk about solving it. And that's what the Child Victims Act has always been about. You don't need 4 legislators yesterday to talk about child abuse. We've had child assault victims come through this Capitol for years telling their stories. I've sat with dozens telling their stories. We knew long before yesterday that it was a problem. We were in denial, and the first obstacle is getting past the denial, which remarkably, there becomes a tipping point. And this is what I was getting to in the 63-0. How did the vote wind up 63-0 when the opposition was so vociferous, we couldn't win a vote last year. How do you go from not a majority to 63 to 0? Because at one point, the opposition loses credibility, and the denial loses credibility. And once you get to that point, then the answer is obvious. Once you get past the denial, we do have a child abuse crisis. Catholic Church, religious organizations, public organizations, the workplace, in the family setting, we do. And I know we don't want to admit it because it makes us feel bad about ourselves. But if you don't admit it, you'll never get past it. We admitted it, and I think that's been the shift.
Governor, can I make one other point? Last year, we put the Child Victims Act into the budget. The Catholic Church raised the issue that they felt it unfairly targeted them and left out the public institutions. In the 30-day amendments last year, we put in the language that we inserted into the bill 2 weeks ago. The Catholic Church, after we did the 30-day amendments, still opposed the bill. If you go back and look, the exact same language that they claim mollified them 2 weeks ago, we put in the 30-day amendments last year. They still opposed it. They still wouldn't bring it to the floor for a vote.
They lost, the opposition lost credibility in their denial. That's what happened. Excuse me, that's what happened here on this issue. The opposition to sensible gun control has lost their credibility. And that's why the red flag bill will pass.
Governor, why not go farther and require affirmative approval rather than just 30 days to reject?
Well, at one point, you're going to run into a constitutional problem. You'll run into a lawsuit for sure, right? You have a federal government that is begging for a lawsuit. And you have a federal government, you have the NRA that will bring a lawsuit if there's a scintilla of evidence. And then you have a federal government and a federal Supreme Court that would love to throw a law out. That's what the New York case is going to be about. So our counsels have said at one point you will beg that constitutional question. Now, I think 30 days, their argument is I have a right to buy a gun unless government can tell me a reason why I should not. The law says a state can restrict the Second Amendment with sensible regulation. So before you can buy a gun, you have to go through a background check. Okay, so you're delaying my right to buy a gun. Yes. Until you go through a background check. Okay, I think Second Amendment person would say, I think you have no right to check my background before I buy a gun. I have an absolute right to buy a gun. That's the Second Amendment. Courts have said you don't have an absolute right. State can enact reasonable regulation. Okay, until you pass a background check. Right now it's 3 days. If you don't pass a background check in 3 days, you can buy the gun. If the government can't prove a reason why you can't in 3 days, then you have the right. How far can you extend the 3 days without triggering a constitutional argument? I think you're right up on the edge at about 30.
It's been several weeks since Joe Lotus stepped down as chairman of the MTA. Could you update us on recruiting a new chair to lead that authority? And could you also tell me how that process relates to your desire to restructure the management of the authority? Are we not going to see a new chair until...
Jimmy, they're connected. You want a new chairman for what organization, with what powers and what structure?
So does that mean no new chair until the end of the session? And
Well, it all has to happen now. What I'm trying to say is you have the same recurring entrenched problems that have frustrated resolution for decades. And if you look at them, they have the same common traits. They tend to be large bureaucratic organizations that nobody wants to take responsibility for. Board of Education in New York City. Nameless, faceless bureaucracy. Who runs education? The Board of Education. Who is the Board of Education? I have no idea. Perfect. Nobody to blame. Mayor Bloomberg comes and says, that will never work. Somebody has to be in charge, mayoral control of education. Yes, we all agree. MTA. Who's in charge? Everybody. Nobody. The mayor, the governor, the county executive, 9 officials appoint 17 members. And it was designed that way in 1968. Nobody wanted to be in charge of running the trains, and nobody wanted to be in charge of raising the fares. So they designed this great Byzantine little structure where everybody has deniability. Yes, but that doesn't work for performance. And the MTA is not performing, and somebody has to be in charge. Well, the political system doesn't want to determine who's in charge. I understand that. But that's what you have to resolve if you're actually going to resolve something. And I am too old to punt a problem down the field without a resolution.
About 10 years ago, there was a law passed that said there will be a chairman and a CEO. They shall be the same person, and there's an appointee. So right now, that slot is vacant. I know that Mr. Ferrer is the acting chair. He's delegated lots of responsibilities to Mr. Foy. So are you saying you're not going to name someone to be chairman and CEO unless or until you get to change structures of the organization?
No, but I'm saying anyone who was thinking and had a conversation with somebody about a chairman, the chairman would say, what are my rights and responsibilities as chairman before I take the job? And you should be able to answer that question. The situation now is non-functional. If you asked me to be the chairman of the MTA, I would say no.
Have you had trouble recruiting it? People said no. The
Well,
structure's
anyone who
fine.
knows what they're talking about says, I'm not going to be chairman of a board of 17 people appointed by 9 people, which capital actions are then subject to unilateral veto by 4 separate elected officials. Who would take that job? Right?
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.